We are back with our annual holiday episode, a time for cheer, reflection, and existential threats. This year, we're unwrapping the connections between nuclear weapons and climate change. Think nuclear winter, but make it seasonal. So stick around as we delve into how rising temperatures and rising tensions might leave us out in the cold, literally and figuratively. But don't worry, it's not just doom and gloom. Climate change is not just about rising sea levels and melting glaciers. It's a global stress test. As droughts worsen and resources like water and farmland shrink, tensions between nuclear countries could heat up. Now imagine if those tensions involve nuclear-armed nations. Not exactly the holiday miracle we're hoping for, right? And, unfortunately, it gets scarier. Many nuclear weapons facilities weren't exactly designed with extreme weather in mind. Hurricanes, wildfires, floods, these events could damage these facilities and potentially increase the risk of accident or security breaches. These aren't two separate problems. They feed into each other, creating a dangerous feedback loop. Climate-driven resource conflicts could spark nuclear escalation, and nuclear war could permanently alter the climate in ways we can't control. But there is hope. A growing number of voices are calling for action, from activists to scientists to policymakers. And the good news is, the solutions to these challenges aren't incompatible. In fact, tackling them together by building resilient infrastructure, fostering diplomacy, and committing to multilateral agreements likely is our best shot at ensuring a safer, more stable future. Today, we're taking a closer look at both of these existential threats so we can understand how they intersect and what we can do to keep both from snowballing in a catastrophe. We would all be affected by either of these. So there is a stake in this for all of us. And today, I am joined by Jamie Kwong to help us learn more about these connections between climate change and nuclear weapons.
My name is Jamie Kwong. I'm a fellow in the Nuclear Policy Program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Thanks so much for having me.
We're so thrilled to have you here. Okay, kind of jumping right into this fun and oftentimes daunting topic. For those who do not see the connection between nuclear weapons and climate change, can you educate us on how they are interconnected?
Sure, of course. And, I think first off, it's important to start with there's a lot of great work out there that looks at the devastating impacts that a detonation of nuclear weapons could have and in a testing context have already had on the environment. If you think about the Marshall Dome, for example, there's some really great work and research and reporting around that, which I think is absolutely critical. But of course, we in this field are dedicated to preventing a nuclear bomb from ever being used again. But even if we are successful, and let's hope we are, I think we still need to think about how there is an intersection between climate change and nuclear weapons. So to put it in the US context, the ongoing modernization campaign aims to ensure that nuclear weapons can deliver the deterrence mission for decades to come. In most cases, we're talking 40 plus years. And of course, we talk a lot about how that's motivated to address a changing geostrategic environment. But I think we need to start asking the question of how much these plans account for a changing geophysical environment, right? How could climate change affect the capacity of our nuclear systems to support the deterrence mission that they're there for? Put it a little bit differently, I think the timelines we think about our modernized nuclear systems really track onto the timelines in which we often think about climate change. So, the midlife of these modernized systems I'm talking about are basically around 2050, or in climate science terms, mid-century, and the end of service life are 2080 onwards, the end of century, right? Are we giving enough thought to how climate change could impact and challenge those systems?
And then just to kind of follow up on that, because I think it's something that we've oftentimes in this field have a bit of a hard time understanding. And then for those who are aware of climate change or nuclear weapons threats may not always put it together. When we are talking about the ways in which you touched on that climate and nuclear is being felt by certain people, where else in the US are those being harmed by nuclear weapons or nuclear weapons facilities where they exist? Are they seeing examples of climate change?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think the Pantex fires is a really great example, and importantly provides an example of a facility in the nuclear enterprise that is a single point of failure, right? So to give a little bit of context, in late February this year, the Pantex plant near Amarillo, Texas, had to pause operations and evacuate non-essential personnel as a wildfire neared the site. And again, Pantex is the only facility in the US for assembling and disassembling nuclear warheads. It is that single point of failure. And luckily, the fire did not end up reaching the site, so everything was okay in that particular episode. But I think this highlights the risks of operations at nuclear sites being entirely disrupted, and if there was significant damage, disrupted for an extended period of time. So, how do we protect Pantex and other elements of the nuclear enterprise, especially these places that play such individual role from climate change and extreme weather events that are only projected to get worse over the century? And, are these activities in some of the most vulnerable areas in climate change terms sustainable in the long run?
And really kind of going into that, are these facilities being prepared for the extreme weather and the threats and the vulnerability that comes with the rising threat of climate change? Is the U.S. government prepared for this?
So I think that's a really important question. Let me take it back a little bit and just kind of get at some of the research findings. So just to flag, I had conducted a study last year that looked specifically at climate change challenges to the U.S. nuclear triad. So I looked at one base that hosts each leg of the triad and kind of considered the local climate change impacts, and from there zoomed out to consider what are the implications for each site. And as part of that process, I was trying to consider, has USG, DoD in particular, been thinking about this, especially again as part of the modernization effort. And so what I found, let me just dive into it a little bit. I looked at the subcase at Kings Bay Naval Base, and submarines, of course, come to mind when we think about climate change because they are stationed on the coast, right? And we think a lot about sea level rise, and we do see sea level rise risks at Kings Bay at that mid-century and end of century timeline that I was talking about. So we can expect that sea level rise will not only pose challenges to facilities that are at the waterfront at Kings Bay, but could also disrupt a key road that connects the on-base missile facility to the waterfront. So the larger implication here is flooding could disrupt operations and submarine servicing and potentially even delay the transport and maintenance of submarines' nuclear missiles. And of course, that issue only gets worse if climate change effects are an extreme hazard like a hurricane prevents a submarine from entering port. In October, I believe it was, Kings Bay just managed to avoid Hurricane Idalia, October 2023, I think it was. And if subs can't enter port, that of course has implications for crew exchanges as well as regular maintenance that we see on these submarines. But let me also touch on the landlocked bases briefly, because I think we often overlook the impact of climate change beyond the coastline. So again, in the US context, I looked at ICBMs that are based at Minot Air Force Base in North Dakota. And we can expect warming temperatures may accelerate extreme flooding that could in turn limit access to ICBM facilities and silos at Minot. Not to mention displaced base personnel like we've already seen happen back in a severe flood in 2011. That of course could have potential cascading effects for the ICBM leg if it delays any critical or time-sensitive maintenance that could reduce the reliability of some missiles. And then in thinking about the bombers, I looked at Whiteman Air Force Base, where we currently have our stealth bombers based. And there's projections that increases in extreme heat conditions and flash flooding could pose potential risks to the aircraft. Essentially, it could affect the times and conditions when bombers can freely take off from or land at Whiteman. And so in investigating a lot of this, I think it became clear that this is a fairly new consideration. And in looking at existing USG documents, and again, in particular DoD, there has been attempts to think about climate adaptation planning, but it's not been nuclear specific. So one of my recommendations has really been to think about mission-specific adaptation.
And something that comes to mind when you say that is, not only thinking about it, but this is a newer thing, right? This is something they are just kind of starting to come around to. How the pacing of the US government works. Are we prepared to handle it at the rate in which we might have to?
I think that's a tough question. It gets ultimately a resource prioritization. And that's a tough one, right? I'm glad I don't sit in government having to choose between these pretty stark priorities here. But, I think it is important to really think about this. And we do have an opportunity as part of this modernization effort that we've already invested so much time, money, and resources in. I think what's really important to think about here is how much can we implement proactive measures? If we're already digging up the missile alert facilities, silos, and in particular the communications cables as part of the Sentinel modernization program, can we integrate additional measures to insulate those systems from some of these climate change effects in ways that could save us costs later down the line? So really thinking about the life-term costs of the system, where we've seen examples, I think of Offutt Air Force Base in North Dakota, which is home of U.S. Strategic Command. There was a pretty severe flood there that flooded 25% of the runway back in 2019, I think it was. And it didn't actually affect STRATCOM, but all of the planes that are based there were essentially grounded or had to be emergency evacuated. I don't have the figure off the top of my head, but the repair costs for that runway were hundreds of millions of dollars, right? But before that flood, there had been a study done that said, hey, you need to fix these flood walls. The base is at risk of a major flood. That would have been, pennies relative to what they had to spend to react to the climate disaster.
How could climate change affect the risk of conflict, especially when we're talking about nuclear-armed countries and a limit of resources?
Yeah, I think that's a really important question because it helps us zoom out from the US specific context. Let me just say from the off, these types of climate impacts are not isolated to the US and may be especially pressing for states like North Korea and Pakistan that have already felt the acute effects of extreme hazards like flooding. In terms of other states, we've seen historically that wildfires have threatened Russian ICBMs. And of course, those fires are only likely to get worse with climate change. In India, the coastal nuclear facilities are projected to face more intense cyclones as global temperatures rise. And even thinking about the NATO DCA, the Dual Capable Aircraft mission, bases that host US nuclear weapons and operate DCA may become more vulnerable to extreme heat and flash flooding and wildfires that could, again, affect the capacity to deliver the DCA mission. So, to your question of what does this mean for the risk of conflict between nuclear armed states, I want to be clear here. I think it's hard to imagine that climate change could entirely undermine the complex enterprises, systems, and operations involved in nuclear weapons programs, right? Taking it back to the US example, I talked about, some missile alert facilities and silos that might not being accessible. Well, those facilities are spread across 5 states, right? So put that in that context. But we can think about how the incidents and accidents caused or exacerbated by climate change could still have widespread effects, especially since these climate risks could exacerbate existing nuclear risks. So I think the best example here is increased force vulnerability is widely seen as an escalation driver. And if climate change is increasing the vulnerability of all of these states' nuclear arsenals, surely that stands to exacerbate escalation risks.
And given your expertise on this and, how much research you've done on this issue, what do you think is an often misconstrued or just simply misunderstood aspect of this conversation that you think people might not have the full story or oftentimes get something confused?
It's a really good question, and I think an important question. Kind of taking it back to where I initially started in doing the lit review for this research, a lot of the intersection conversation around nuclear and climate thinks about what happens after a nuclear weapon goes off. Again, extremely important to do that research to understand the effects. But I think what's often missing from the conversation is what about this intersection now? And so that's where I've tried to help open up the conversation. I wouldn't say I've completely answered it. I wouldn't say this is done. I think this research should expand to include all DoD, DOE nuclear facilities, as well as to do this type of analysis for other nuclear armed states, right? It's harder as a nuclear expert, for example, to get climate data from China or Russia. And so can we engage and really lean into this intersection with climate science to engage with, climate experts to really evaluate, all right, we have these weapons. maybe we don't want them anymore, but as long as we have them, we have to make sure that they are safe and secure. And of course, we're doing that to ensure that there's no adversarial threats, what have you. We also need to make sure that the environment and these climate change effects won't have dangerous impacts on these systems for as long as we have them.
And really looking at, the US is going to have a change in administrations in the new year. And the Trump administration previously had rolled back some climate change policies. So how are countries working together towards this problem, or are they not doing that? Like, how is the international community addressing this? Because as you've pointed out before, this is an international problem.
Yeah, so specifically on the Trump administration, I think it comes down to a question of framing here. So actually a lot of the bases that I looked at are in Republican districts. So I actually spent a good amount of time on the Hill briefing Republican Senate and House staff on these implications. And it was a very engaging conversation. And so I think if we can frame this in terms of the security impacts, again, of the budgetary impacts, obviously these bases are huge sources of income in these districts. And so thinking in those types of terms, I think, is quite important. In terms of, again, zooming out of the US context, I think there is a potential silver lining here to this pretty concerning nexus, right? Since all nuclear armed states are vulnerable to these climate impacts on their arsenals, maybe there could be mutual interest in adopting measures to reduce associated risks. So at minimum, could that entail a dialogue on best practices for assessing and mitigating climate change challenges to nuclear programs. Again, perhaps open avenues for cooperation, like sharing the latest climate research that helps states to better prepare to address these common challenges and ensure they don't become these risk exacerbators that we talked about.
And to kind of wrap this up, this is a holiday episode, very festive and cheery, I know. How, given just your depth and breadth of knowledge of this, right? How do you talk about this issue and how do you kind of raise awareness around this? I think there's some people who, they get scared. There's so many existential threats out there, it's hard for them to focus on this. But how do you communicate this issue and say how this impacts everyone and how they can get involved and learn more?
Yeah, I think that's a great question to kind of wrap up on. So in conducting this research, my partner joked with me and he said, well, so you already study one of the existential crises and you decided to add the other in on top? That seems like an interesting choice. But, I think there is potential hope here. Again, that silver lining of, can this open up dialogue? I think to one of your points, this is also an opportunity to engage a lot of stakeholders. I briefly mentioned, for example, in Minot, how we saw personnel evacuated because of the severe flood that they faced in 2011. That obviously affected Air Force personnel, but also the local community, right? And so these climate impacts happening at bases or other nuclear facilities around the world will impact the local residents as well. And I think there's a lot of opportunity here to engage with those stakeholders so that a well-resourced military base can interact with a local community that maybe isn't well-resourced, and they can cooperate to develop natural infrastructure solutions or build infrastructure solutions that not only, again, protects these weapons as long as we have them, but also has positive impacts in terms of insulating those communities from some of these devastating impacts as well.
And where can people go to find your research to learn more?
All of my research is available on the Carnegie Endowment website. There's a research report down there, as well as a couple of articles that dives a little bit more into depth into some of these issues.
Jamie, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for joining us today, and thank you to Jamie for joining us for this episode. And a heartfelt thank you to all of our listeners for being with us throughout this year. As we wrap up another incredible year of Nuke Talk, let's take a quick look back. We began with Season 3, Atomic Assembly, which explored the rise and fall of U.S. nuclear towns during the atomic age. Then, this fall, we brought you Season 4, The Nuclear Ballad, which dived into how the U.S. election could shape domestic and global nuclear policy. And with that, we're signing off for the year. We wish you all a happy holidays and a wonderful new year.